All right, good afternoon. Second to last day of the semester. Going to keep it light today, and we'll also keep it light tomorrow. I think what I want to do is take these last couple days of the semester and then kind of get to some of what people typically regard as sort of like the big high stakes issues, not just as it pertains to economic systems, but how much it pertains to just general sort of human systems and what are some of the important conversations and how does that bump up against what we have been saying about macroeconomics and certainly in the context of macroeconomic policy. So what I thought I would do real quick at the beginning of this particular lecture, because we mentioned here at the end of yesterday's lecture, we're wrapping up the solo growth. We're pretty much done with it. And the sort of big thing with solo, the sort of net kind of idea is that you want to have this sort of balanced growth over time, right? So you want the central bank or even the government may have some role in promoting the idea of a particular savings rate, and so as the economy in a sense grows, there is this space for policymakers to, in a sense, get the economy to its optimal place with respect to economic growth. And again, the solo model is, and this is, I think, sometimes lost a little bit because within the model, you spend so much time talking about capital accumulation or capital shedding. And so it feels like it's a model that's about capital. But at the end of the day, remember that this ends up being a conversation about consumption. When we talk about golden rule, the golden rule is defined as the path of policy that gets us to the highest possible consumption level. And so this is, I think, one of the criticisms of economics to some extent would be that it promotes sort of certain ideas that perhaps have these unintended consequences. And I certainly think that there's reason for us to be somewhat cautious about the notion that consumption maximization is the end all be all of how we want to think about a macroeconomic system. But remember that what the solo model is about is growth. And the other thing about the solo model that's really important to keep in mind is that, again, when we say balanced growth, what we mean is that it certainly could be the case that you can, through attempting to grow your economy very, very rapidly, that you can actually find yourself on the wrong end of a steady state capital situation, in which case the backtracking of your economic system, the capital shedding part, we expect to be quite painful. Whereas, of course, if you're on the other side of the steady state position, you're growing. You're in a sense having the exact opposite issue, not painful in the slightest necessarily. And so that piece of the goal of policy is not to just grow the economy as rapidly as possible, despite the fact that at the end of the day, the goal is to maximize consumption. Because the lesson here, at least in part, is that if you try to maximize, in a sense, your society's consumption today, you are going to not maximize it over the long run. And so if you want to maximize your society's consumption over the very long run, then you have to think about economic growth in a much more balanced way. And sort of one of the major points that I brought up yesterday was this idea of creating an economic system that can accommodate things like population growth, technological growth. Again, we may see something like technological growth, because I think people can understand why population growth can put a strain on an economic system for multiple reasons. But with technological growth, so why would that sort of be problematic? Beyond, of course, the whole conversation about societal effects of an increasingly technological world, which we'll leave that to the philosophy classes and sociology classes and things like that. But why is technology problematic? Well, technology is problematic because it can very rapidly alter the nature of your country's production function in such a way that, in a sense, your economic and social ordering is not prepared for. And we've seen this, by the way, in times with countries who have sought extremely rapid economic growth. So we're thinking about developing economies, and very often have turned to companies and also governments in developed economies in particular to really kind of get that rapidity of economic growth to the system. So, foreign direct investment and that, non-governmental organizations and all these things, excuse me, International Monetary Fund, right? Well, all these things that are there to kind of kickstart economic development, to try to make economic growth more rapid. We have certainly seen instances in which countries have poorly managed that growth. And so maybe they've grown very rapidly, very quickly, but then, in a sense, their economic and social systems weren't prepared for it, and so then there was a drop off. So there's a lesson, there's a sort of a constant lesson in macroeconomics, which is that we don't really use the word sustainable very often, because I think sustainable is such a nebulous word. But that's the kind of the way that we want to think. Like, what is going to sustain economic growth over the long run? And one of the things that we know is that it's not, trying to get 20% growth rate. In a sense, 20% growth rates can be good if they are the natural consequence of being far below your steady state. But if a country is, let's say, closer to their steady state than what would normally produce, say, 20% economic growth, but then the country pursued through highly stimulatory subsidies, any number of reasons, and then they overshoot that growth, and so now they end up having to experience this relatively painful bout of capital shedding, which can certainly become an issue, and in fact could potentially reduce the overall quality of life if we just look at something like consumption. So again, important things to keep in mind. Now, on the tax side of things, there's a couple of things that I want to mention. I'm a public finance economist, so taxes are one of the things I spend a lot of my life thinking about. And there are just some simple sort of public financy things that I think is worthwhile for us to have a conversation about. One of the things that we're going to talk about tomorrow is government debt. And so that's to me kind of the end of the semester is going to be a government debt and a climate change lecture. So we're going to end the semester on a bit of a cynical place. But I think that those two issues, certainly for the U.S. economy, I think are potentially the biggest issues over the very, very long run. There's a multitude of short run problems certainly as well, but I think long term those are kind of my two biggest concerns. So anyway, now with taxes, when we think about tax systems, especially from a macro perspective, of course we tend to think just in terms of federal taxes. It is always important to keep in mind that any sort of subsequent subnational tax scheme, tax regime is going to play, into the extent to which the federal government is able to raise revenue through taxes and then accomplish certain economic goals through tax policy. But even within that backdrop, the economists think the taxes. There's sort of three big things that we're kind of worried about with taxes. Efficiency. So we want the tax to accomplish what we want the tax to accomplish. And you could tax for really just two reasons. One, you want to generate revenue to fund something. And the second is that you want to curtail that particular economic behavior. So we tax certain types of behavior because we, in fact, want to reduce that particular type of behavior. And so efficiency here just kind of refers to the extent to which the tax really accomplishes what it's supposed to accomplish, and then also does not create a lot of distortion. One of the big concerns that we typically have with taxes is that for those revenue generating taxes, especially, we don't want there to be a lot of distortion. We don't want there to be a lot of spillover caused by any particular tax. And so policymakers have to be very cognizant of the potential for a tax to trigger a behavioral change that then causes a behavioral change somewhere else that perhaps was not predicted. Again, this plays very much into those conversations about micro foundations and how having a solid understanding of consumer theory really helps to inform us as we get into conversations about things like taxes. Economists very much believe that tax systems should be equitable to some extent, and certainly equitable along two particular lines. The first is vertical equity. So the idea of vertical equity is that due to the nature of money and due to the nature of purchasing power, the more money you have, there's this multiplicative geometric effect in terms of your purchasing power. And so as rich people get even richer, they can, they solve all the necessities of life, and then they can sort of just add a lot of additional consumption to that. And so from an equitable perspective, if we want to tax people at sort of roughly the same proportion, then one way we can think about that is in terms of like purchasing power. So we tax people in what they could purchase. And so that leads us to sort of progressive tax systems, taxing richer people at higher rates than relatively poorer people. And then there's also horizontal tax equity, which has to do with taxing people of similar purchasing power the same. So we don't want people in similar income or wealth situations to be taxed very differently. So again, that can sort of create these sort of distortionary behavioral changes. And then simplicity, right? We want a tax system which is simple. Now, we don't have a simple tax system in the US, but no economist wants a non-simple tax system. Now, one could argue that one of the reasons why we don't have a simple tax system is because we're trying to accomplish these two goals simultaneously, which can be to some extent difficult to do. There is this sort of classic efficiency versus equity trade-off just in kind of general economics, right? So like, for example, it would be perhaps more economically efficient to not have, let's say, unemployment insurance, because then people wouldn't have this backstop and then they would have to find jobs immediately. But we as society say that feels kind of immoral. And so we're gonna help people if they happen to lose their job so that they can keep paying the bills while they look for a new job. There's also some ancillary economic benefits to that as well. But just sort of as an argument, the more profligate you make, say, unemployment insurance, the idea is that you're making your system more equitable, but you potentially could reduce the efficiency. People like to point out, for example, that in Europe, those countries by and large have much longer and more forgiving unemployment insurance systems, and you tend to see more chronic bouts of unemployment in European countries than we have in the U.S. So again, it's not to say one is right versus one is wrong, but there does seem to be somewhat of a trade-off in terms of to the extent to which you help people during economic time periods, and then kind of the extent to which the economic system and the labor markets and things like that work kind of relatively efficiently. Most economists, myself included, we end up falling sort of on the position that, especially in a country like the U.S., that produces so much prosperity and wealth for people at the very top, it not only makes sense from a sort of moral perspective for there to be a sort of progressive nature to the tax system, but arguably, if income inequality gets bad enough, then progressive taxation is going to be good for the economy, because you're actually going to allow people to consume who perhaps would not otherwise be able to consume things. And again, in an economy where we want to maximize consumption, it makes sense for us to think about that in the context of taxation. And then, in that sense, we can sort of think of there being roughly two types of taxes in the context of revenue generation. So income and wealth taxes, and then consumption taxes. So this is there's some basic ideas here about sort of what these taxes sort of represent along those equity efficiency lines I was just mentioning. Income and wealth taxes tend to be progressive, but they also tend to be like highly distortionary. They also tend to be very complex because of the multiple asset classes that people have access to. So it's hard to some sense tax everything or to figure out how to efficiently tax things. And it's also easy to evade income and wealth taxes. especially in a world in which you can move money overseas and there are so-called tax havens. So income and wealth taxes are progressive and they're a way for you to make your system progressive, but they're the hardest taxes to actually accomplish. And then we can get into the normative conversations about, that and the notion of rich people being unwilling to kind of pay into society. And I'm certainly here for those conversations, but from just the practical consideration of the need to raise revenue, there's a reason why economists are a little bit dubious about income and wealth taxation, despite the fact that, again, the mainstream position of most economists is that we like the idea of a progressive system. Our concern is that in attempting to make the system progressive, you have also basically created a very Swiss cheese tax system that is easily attacked by very smart and ambitious accountants at the behest of their clients. And so the other sort of option, of course, would be like consumption taxes, but consumption taxes are unpopular very often because they're regressive, right? Because you're charging poor people essentially the same you're taxing rich people. Now, the idea would be that tax people do consume more, but in terms of those like basics of life, you would be burdening low income people more than you would be burdening high income people. So just legitimately regressive. But the nice thing about consumption taxes is they have a very broad base, like sort of the broadest base possible, because people have to consume things. And it's very hard to evade consumption taxes because it's very easy to just institute point of sale tax payments. It's very, very easy to do. I mean, look at Europe. In Europe, most countries have a VAT, a value added tax. A value added tax is essentially a point of sales tax at every step of the supply chain. And I think whenever you mention this to an American, they go, God, that sounds horribly complex. It actually isn't, because it's all just sales taxes. So you can just, the technology, the baker pays the farmer for the wheat, and when they go to make that payment, the tax is automatically applied and taken out, just like happens with you at the grocery store. In the US, we're the one doing this sort of antiquated system of every year you got to send in this paperwork to quote unquote even up with the government. And yeah, it's quite weird. But the thing about it is that it persists in the US largely because, from a political perspective, liberals, the Democratic Party in the U.S., they tend to really dislike consumption taxes because of that regressivity. Now, in Europe, they do consumption taxes. They lean on them a lot more than they do income and wealth taxes, and yet the totality of European systems is arguably far more progressive than the U.S., because what they do in European countries is they facilitate these burdensome consumption taxes with a tremendous amount of subsidization coming from the government. So healthcare, educational services, a lot more welfare given back to low-income individuals. So it makes that consumption tax system quite actually progressive. And so, yeah, I mean, and the thing about consumption taxes versus income and wealth is that they just generate more revenue more efficiently, so ultimately. And so the sort of net result of kind of the modern economics take on taxes is that, especially as it pertains to like corporate taxes and like what we might refer to as like asset taxes, it's very difficult. And there's certainly an economic argument in the context of growth for us to not necessarily try to tax those asset classes either a lot or in these very complex ways that end up being easy to evade anyway. Now, again, that's going to be very unpopular, predominantly for people on the left who feel like, tax sort of becomes this sticking it to these corporate behemoths. But you really, despite my personal politics often agreeing with those people, you can't design a tax system in that sort of, I would say, vengeful way, right? You want to design a tax system in a way that actually accomplishes what you want to accomplish. And in a way, your tax system should probably avoid this sort of like political socio-engineering us into the fairest world possible. We can do that through a combination of things. It can't just be the tax system that does that, because the tax system is never able to do that. So anyway, I just wanted to say a little bit about taxes. You probably no doubt picked up that I really enjoy that particular conversation. And ultimately in macro, you end up just sort of referring, tax ends up just being the letter T in the models that we've talked about. It just ends up being tax revenue collections. And so it makes sense for us to, at some point in the semester, engage in some conversation about this. I will certainly be willing to send you more information if you're interested in more of the tax conversation. That's obviously a very big part of the sort of macroeconomic policy debate over the last 30 or 40 years, especially in the United States. So there's a lot there, but intermediate macro, we end up just needing to focus on other things ultimately. Now, the other thing that I mentioned yesterday that's very tricky from a policy perspective is this idea of the government pursuing what's known as industrial policy. Now, I think it's important for us to talk about industrial policy right now, especially because both, and I wouldn't, and it's not just in the U.S., it has become an increasingly held belief by voters of countries that the government is actually the goal of government should be to pursue a particular industrial mix. So an economist thinks about all the different things that your economy makes as your economy's industrial mix. And so the idea here would be is that industrial policy would seek to essentially determine that industrial mix. Now, to economists, we think that the likelihood that that would be efficient is pretty low. We think it's far more likely that if the industrial mix is determined instead by a system of relative comparative advantages, a la David Ricardo's ideas way back in the 1800s, we just expect that system to produce a much more efficient and ultimately, therefore, growing industrial mix. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a place for some industrial policy. The thing about industrial policy, though, is it's also prone to so-called race to the bottom in terms of, and I'd like to bring this up in particular with respect to tax policy. So in the U.S., we have this big problem where states and localities, and even to some extent the federal government, are constantly trying to court businesses and corporations with tax breaks. And the argument is, hey, if we give you a tax break, you're going to bring us jobs, and then that's going to be good for the economic system. Well, putting aside the fact that if we're talking about states and localities, it doesn't matter in the macro economy where that is in the U.S. If it's in the U.S., it's going to contribute to sort of GDP. But if we take that idea and we think about it in terms of like countries, now you definitely run into the potential problem of, for example, having tax havens and then the distortionary potential of tax havens to not just, benefit tax havens, but to then ultimately hurt other countries, right? So one of the things that we're going to talk about a little bit today and then into tomorrow as well is the nature of kind of country-to-country policies, country-to-country trade policies, country-to-country tax policies, and the extent to which that very often countries find themselves in this sort of oddly competitive position where it's not the businesses in the U.S. versus the businesses in China, it's the U.S. versus China. And economists, again, we find this wholly unproductive. We don't think countries should really be competing with each other. Rather, we think that they should be facilitating the competition of the businesses they're in, and then the subsequent industrial mix, the subsequent importation, exportation, again, being facilitated by liquidity markets and well thought out and prescribed central bank and fiscal policy. That's sort of how we should let that play out. But politicians just have a very good story to tell potential voters about their ability to, quote, bring in jobs. There's this concept in public finance called the ribbon cutting effect, where politicians, instead of trying to maximize, in a sense, their voters' welfare, they instead just maximize the extent to which they get to stand in front of things and cut ribbons and say, look at what I did. And so if a politician can say cut a tax to a Volkswagen plant in Tennessee, and then that Volkswagen plant opens up, and then the politician can say, "Look what I did." Then that obviously is going to make them relatively popular with voters. But that's really moving us into a world that is not very capitalistic, if you can imagine, because now what we're saying is that government policy not only affects business decisions, but in fact is specifically about motivating particular business decisions, and not just profit maximization, from an efficiency standpoint, but rather locate here because we're going to cut you the best deal, but not necessarily locate here because it's what's best for the broader macro economy. So it's problematic. And ultimately, I think, it's why people like myself, who tend to be, fairly Keynesian in our views in terms of short run fluctuations, we tend to be, the government should be activist at times when, in a sense, the economy calls for it. We're still extremely reticent to the idea of industrial policy. The picking of winners and losers just sort of frightens us, and we just don't think that bureaucrats, and this this ends up sounding like a very libertarian sort of conservative position, and I guess it is in some argument, but to me it's an economic position, which is that I don't trust even politicians that I like on certain, in terms of social policy. I hear their words. I don't trust them economically all the time. So why would I then trust them to somehow know what industrial mix would be best for their constituents? This is where I trust the market more than I trust politicians. And again, I think it's healthy for us to be skeptical of industrial policy in particular. Now, this moves us into the sort of kind of final conversation of this sort of economic growth thing, and that is moving from kind of the solo model idea, which is a model which is, again, is kind of heavily focused on the way we used to think about economic systems. There's some classical stuff in there. There's obviously some Keynesian stuff. Bob Solow was a prominent economist in the Kennedy administration and I think Lyndon Johnson administration. So he was heavily influential in terms of economic policy in the 60s, 70s, and even on and through into the 80s. But we did sort of move and evolve somewhat away from just the relatively simple world of the Solow growth model. And what this sort of moves us into now is a conversation a little bit more about maybe growth is not exogenous to some capital and labor and technology mix of a particular country, right? So if we just go back to this idea that don't lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, what we end up caring about here is, this idea of there being a production function, right? So Y is some function of capital and labor. And then what we often do now is, just to add a little bit more realistic complexity here, is we're going to say that Y is equal to A times some function of capital and labor. And then again, we just most often will just give this Cobb-Douglas form because it makes our life a lot easier to think in those ways. And so the idea, sort of the traditional idea, is that growth is all about this. Growth was just all about capital and labor and and technology mattered, but that technology was constant, that a country had a particular technological level, and then that sort of persisted over time. But the problem is that the Solow growth model does not do a good enough job of explaining why we see so much empirical variance on country to country outcomes, even when country to countries tend to have similar capital or labor mixes. And so then we have to look beyond just the mixture of capital and labor. And we have to think, okay, why is this country growing and this other country is not? What are the differences between these two particular countries? Now, to some extent, this gets us into a really interesting empirical conversation about the conversation of reverse causality. So let's just say that people tend to think in terms of this, and that is that GDP growth causes, let's say, something like education, right? So GDP growth causes education to increase, right? And maybe that's true in a very primitive economic system, right? But maybe the nature of this sort of process changes as the success of the economic system changes, to the extent that maybe in developed economies, it's really no longer the case that GDP causes education, but maybe that causality is flipped. And now it's the case that education is what leads to GDP, right? There's all sorts of systems in which this type of process happens, where there is some initial impetus for the system growing. And then at a certain point, the impetus for why the system grew became the source of the growth and some other sort of causal perspective. And so what economists had to grapple with is that maybe the solo growth, which of course would argue that this is sort of what's going on, and therefore the focus should be on growth. But maybe there's more to the story, and in particular, maybe technology in particular is endogenous. And so if technology is endogenous, then this means that productivity is also potentially endogenous as well. And if productivity is endogenous, then what this means is that it's going to be very difficult for us to carry out a theoretical to empirical process in order to find the relative truth here. Right? So the main problem in empirical economics is endogenous factors. Right? Because let's say, for example, I want to run a regression and I put GDP of country I and time period T as the dependent variable. And then on the right-hand side, the independent variables, let's say I have something like education, right? And time in country I, time period T. I have some, control suite here. So we'll just call these controls. Now, the controls are there in a sense to reduce the potential endogeneity problem, right? If you know anything about regression analysis, you know that controls are there to turn off some of the endogeneity of the empirical model. But one of the things we know in economics is that that's very hard to do, especially for things that are deeply endogenous. So the education of a particular country in a particular year is likely going to be deeply endogenous to the GDP, such that if I try to measure the effect of education on GDP, one of the key empirical problems with that is that education also likely causes GDP. GDP also likely causes education. And so, in a sense, we had to think outside of the box of solo growth, because the solo growth model did not answer the things empirically that we expected it to. Now, remember, solo growth does a very good job once you just sort of look at particular countries. But the moment you start comparing countries, that's when the empirical sort of stylized facts don't necessarily hold up. And so what was developed post-solo growth theory was this concept called endogenous growth theory. Now, I'm going to leave that for the next video, but just to kind of, sort of set it up and why we're here. Again, going back to this idea. So the solo growth model says that basically what matters in terms of economic growth is all about capital, labor, and then the constant productivity over the long run. And you could even calibrate the model to say some countries have high technology and some countries have low technology. But what happens when technology is changing in both countries, right? Because here's the thing, right? Here's the complexity of this, is that in an open economic system, capital flows in one country have the potential to affect capital flows in another country. And so if A is increasing in the US, but simultaneously increasing in other parts of the world, And if the flow of especially capital, but even to some extent labor, but mostly capital is dependent upon the behavior of both countries, then that relative change in productivity is not necessarily going to affect the countries in the same way. So, in other words, an increase in productivity for the US may be distinct or perhaps more long lasting than a technological improvement in some other country. And so then the question is, why would that be? Why would it be the case that technology seems to just matter more, as one way to put it, in one country than another? And so what we would develop is this idea of the endogenous growth model. And the idea ultimately ends up being about institutions, political systems, tax systems, legal systems, property rights systems. All of these systems matter, infrastructure systems matter. That countries that grow well economically tend to be countries that have good social, political, and economic systems. So it isn't just enough to have a good mixture of capital and labor and to be a productive country in terms of your production function, but that there is a facilitation of your ability to be productive through these sort of systems. When you open the notion up to that idea, what you find is that now there's a fairly clear empirical story to tell, and we will tell that story in the next video.